Okay, welcome, friends. We're going to talk a little bit about the early caliphates under the Umayyad and the Abbasid dynasties. So you have your note sheet already, and so we're just going to pick up kind of where we left off from class. So remember, we're looking at this map of the Islamic world today, and so we're going to talk about how it gets to this size over the next few minutes. So first, we left off talking about the split between the Sunni and Shia. But while we're at it, we need to talk about Sufi Muslims. And so this, every religion has kind of a mystical element. And so for Muslims, or I should say for Islam, Sufism is the mystical element. So they're often poets or scholars, people who are living more ascetic lives. They work to focus on a personal relationship with Allah, and they can be Sunni or Shia. And as you know from your reading, Islam spreads primarily through Sufi Muslims, and they often to try to reach God in a personal way, they often did singing or dancing, some sort of ritualized dancing to kind of put them in a trance almost to communicate more closely with God. And so they're often going to be holy men. They might not, they might look like beggars on the street, right? But they would just travel, kind of live on charity as people took care of them as they spread the message. And what made them so popular is they encouraged people to follow God in their own ways. And maybe if you found it through maybe some traditional beliefs, they would be okay with that, even though maybe other Muslims would not be okay with that. So these slides are already on Blackboard, but you can click on that link below to see what's called the whirling dervishes in Turkey. And so you can see them pictured here in this picture, or painting, I should say. And so they hold, they spin in a certain way, and they hold their head and their hands in symbolic ways. And then by spinning, they sort of, in that trance-like state, gain a closer understanding of God. Okay, so here are some dates to just keep in perspective. So after the death of Muhammad, right, they started to spread out the Islamic Empire, and this is where we start to see the conflict with the leadership, right, as different clans gained control, especially the Umayyad clan. And so by the 640s, they've conquered Egypt and North Africa. They're going to topple the Persian or Sassanid dynasty, and they're going to go all the way into India and conquer the Hindu kingdom of Sind, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then they're also then moving throughout Northwest Africa and through the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spain and Portugal. And remember, at 711, they were defeated in Tours in France, and so they'll retreat and then remain in Spain. And so we've talked about why does this happen so quickly. Remember, the enemies, the Byzantines, the Persians, were kind of in decline. Islam and their message was popular, and this is when we talked about creating this Islamic world, or Dar al-Islam. So here's dates and a map. Hopefully looks something like the map you have created, right? And so you can see the dates here as it spreads. Okay, so we're going to start with, I guess technically the second caliphate after the one that Muhammad established. And this is the Umayyad dynasty. So remember some background. After the Civil War, he murdered Ali, which also, of course, fostered the split, and he established this new dynasty. And under this tradition, right, the caliphs were not related to Muhammad. he moved the capital out of Mecca to Damascus, even though Mecca will always be this spiritual homeland for Islam. And the Umayyads really were run by the Arabian military aristocracy. And this will also be part of their downfall. So remember, the conquered people were considered dhimmis, Christians and Jews are people of the book. They often had to pay a jizya, a tax, and they could continue with their own religious beliefs, but had to pay a tax. And this is what kind of led to their downfall is that converts, especially if they were non-Arab converts, could never kind of get into this military aristocracy that dominated dynasty, so they did not often enjoy wealth or any authority. So some of the accomplishments under the Umayyad we'll talk about in Spain, and then of course building the Dome of the Rock Mosque or Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. This was done under the Umayyad dynasty. And so the decline, you can kind of see trouble spots already. And this is typical of most empires, right, and civilizations, that the rulers sort of become alienated, especially from their base of the Arabs. They flaunted their wealth, which started to make them unpopular, and they started to face more resistance of the Shia faction, right? They're not getting over the murder of Ali and his son Hussein. Tension with the conquered people obviously increased as they became wealthy and maybe not as inclusive. And so eventually there was a rebellion and the Umayyad family is slaughtered. One son escapes to Spain, and that's they form this breakaway Umayyad dynasty that's going to last in some form or another. Maybe different families will rule it, but until 1492, which we've talked about already. So the Abbasid then becomes the next dynasty, and it begins with Abu al-Abbas, and he, while connected to Muhammad through family, and he is a Sunni, but he uses that and gains Shia support and non-Arab Muslims or Mawali to help him overthrow the Umayyad. And the black flag becomes their symbol. So they start to seize control of Persia and Mesopotamia, and then by 750 destroy the Umayyad forces in battle. And you can see that this is the most influential of the post-classical Islamic empires, because it lasts for a long time. And I know you're wondering, that's awfully specific date. We'll talk about why that is in a second. So they maintain their popularity because they kind of learn, in my opinion, from Umayyad mistakes. And they grow, but not always initiated by the central government. But like all of our great empires, are very well administered. So, as we've spoken about in class, or we will speak about in class, they're going to rely heavily on Persians and Persian governing techniques. And as we've spoken many times, the Persians were some of the best empire builders in history. And they're going to move the capital to Baghdad from Damascus. And that will remain until 1258 CE. And governors will rule provinces, so that's once again dividing it up. And they'll have the ulama or religious scholars, judges, will rule local areas, but remember you always have not only political but the religious intertwined. Okay, so under the Abbasid dynasty, the Islamic Empire reaches this golden age. We'll talk a lot more about this in class. And one of the great rulers of this time is Harun al-Rashid. And I think, especially of maybe ancient or post-classical, I think it might be, in my opinion, the high point. And so we'll talk more, and we'll watch our video in class more about Baghdad becoming just a cosmopolitan city center. But like all good things come to an end, but keep in mind, we're talking several hundreds of years. So as usual, you have a charismatic leader, and conflict amongst the sons, right? Can't seem to lead in the same way. A lot of times it was hard to maintain a central authority, right? As governors built their own power bases and established their own family dynasties. Even these local commanders would even take the title of sultan, right? Which would have been technically the leader of the entire dynasty. And the usual, right? Popular uprisings, peasant rebellions that we've seen throughout history. And by 945 CE, we'll have Persian nobles seize control of Baghdad, called the Buyids, and they'll control the Abbasid Caliph. He'll become a puppet, right? And they'll become figureheads. And by 1055, we start to see the transference, slowly but surely, from Arabs and Persians into the Turks. So they'll now be the new kind of controllers of the Abbasid family. And then it comes to a definite end, and we'll talk more about this later, when the Mongols sack Baghdad and bring an ultimate end to the Abbasid dynasty. So keep track of these dates, right? That the Abbasid lasts a long time, but slowly enters in decline by the time the Mongols appear. And we'll talk more about this in class, but one of the high points, in my opinion, is the House of Wisdom, right? Established in Baghdad, where people from all over the world came, and, or I should say, maybe the Middle East and Europe and North Africa would come and share knowledge. And this is why I maintain it's one of the high points. Okay, so that's all for our history portion of the Islamic empires, and hopefully you took good notes.